Clara Mae Sullivan's hands shook as she stepped off the stagecoach in Silver Creek, Montana. 3 weeks of running. 3 states between her and the man who'd sworn she'd never escape. The summer sun burned against her bruised arms, hidden beneath worn cotton sleeves. Behind her lay everything she'd known. Before her stood nothing but dust and desperate hope. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe and follow this story to the very end. Hit that like button and comment with your city, so I can see how far Clara's journey travels. Now, let's begin. The July heat pressed down on Silver Creek like a punishment from God himself. Clara stood outside the land office, her carpetbag clutched against her chest, watching men in dusty boots pass without a glance. Good. Invisible was good. Invisible meant safe. You the one answering the cooking advertisement? Clara turned. A man blocked the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing his grief like other men wore their hats. Dark hair needed cutting, jaw needed shaving, eyes needed nothing because they'd already decided everything about her. Yes, sir, Clara Sullivan. Josiah Callahan, folks call me Joe. He didn't offer his hand. You're late. Stage was due 3 hours ago. Wheel broke outside Helena. We had to wait for... Don't need your reasons, need to know if you can cook. Clara straightened her spine. She'd learned something in her 27 years. Survival didn't require approval. It only required showing up. I can cook, Mr. Callahan. It's just Joe. Mr. makes me feel like my father and I didn't much like him. He turned and walked toward a wagon without checking if she followed. Ranch is 7 miles out. You'll cook for 12 hands plus me. Breakfast at dawn, supper at dusk. Wages are room board and $15 a month. 15. She'd hoped for 20. But 15 was enough to disappear again if she needed to. Enough to keep running until Silas Garrett's reach couldn't find her. That's acceptable. Joe loaded her carpetbag into the wagon with less care than she'd have liked. Got rules. You follow them, we won't have problems. What kind of rules? He climbed onto the wagon seat, waited until she'd pulled herself up beside him before answering. Don't steal. Don't drink my whiskey. Don't bring trouble to my door. Clara almost laughed. Trouble was already riding toward her. It wore a fine suit and spoke with honeyed words and had promised to find her no matter how far she ran. And one more thing. Joe's voice dropped something raw, bleeding through the flatness. I've got a daughter. 5 years old. You won't interact with her. She doesn't come in the kitchen. You don't go looking for her. Clara's breath caught. Sir Joe, I don't understand. If she's hungry... She eats with me, separately. That's the arrangement. His hands tightened on the reins. I'll make her meals myself. You just keep the hands fed and stay away from my child. Can you do that? No. The word pressed against Clara's teeth. What kind of father kept his daughter hidden like a shameful secret? What kind of man hired help and forbade them from basic human kindness toward a child? But Clara needed this job. Needed the distance from Ohio, the anonymity of a Montana cattle ranch, the chance to breathe without Silas's shadow choking her. I can do that. Joe nodded, once snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Clara gripped the seat edge as Silver Creek fell away behind them, replaced by endless grass and summer sky, and the particular loneliness of a man who'd walled himself off from everything that might hurt him. She recognized that loneliness. She'd worn it herself for 3 years. The Callahan Ranch sprawled across the valley like something that had grown from the earth itself. Cattle dotted the distant hills. Horses moved in a corral near the main house. And the house looked like it was slowly surrendering to neglect, paint peeling, and porch sagging, and windows filmed with dust. Kitchen's around back, Joe said, pulling the wagon to a stop. Your room's off of it. Small, but it's got a door that locks. A door that locks. Clara's throat tightened. Such a simple thing. Such an impossible luxury when you'd spent 3 years in a house where every door opened at someone else's will. Thank you. Joe glanced at her, something flickering in those gray-blue eyes. Ranch hands eat in 30 minutes. Can you manage? I can manage." She climbed down without waiting for help, grabbed her carpet bag and walked toward her new life. The kitchen told a story Clara had learned to read like scripture. Grease caked on the stove, flour gone rancid in its sack, dried beans scattered across a counter that hadn't been wiped in weeks. The previous cook had either quit or been fired, and no one had cared enough to clean up after. Clara set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. By the time the sun touched the horizon, she'd scrubbed the stove, salvaged what she could from the pantry, and produced biscuits that came out of the oven, golden and steaming. The bacon wasn't fresh, but it crisped up well enough. The eggs were passable. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. The ranch hands filed in at the first ring of the dinner bell, 12 men ranging from a boy barely old enough to shave to an old-timer with tobacco-stained teeth and knowing eyes. They stopped when they saw the food. "Lord have mercy," the old one breathed. "That real bread. Biscuits," Clara said, setting out plates. "Bacon and eggs on the stove. Help yourselves." They didn't need telling twice. Men fell on the food like they hadn't eaten in days, which, judging by the state of the kitchen, might not have been far from the truth. The sounds of chewing filled the room, that particular silence of people too busy enjoying food to waste breath on words. The old-timer lingered after the others had gone. "Name's Pete," he said, studying her with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by surfaces. "Been foreman here 20 years. Through both of Joe's wives, God rest their souls." Both wives. Clara filed that away. "Nice to meet you, Pete." "You ain't gonna ask what happened to him." "It's not my business." Pete grunted something like approval, crossing his weathered face. "First one died in childbirth. Baby didn't make it neither. Second one, that was Eliza Rosie's mama, took sick 2 years back. Typhoid fever. She was gone in 3 days. Clara's heart twisted. Rosie. The daughter Joe had forbidden her to interact with. The child hidden away from the world. That's a lot of loss for one man. Too much. Rosie was there when Eliza passed. Watched her mama die, screaming in pain, calling out for Joe, who was riding for the doctor, and didn't make it back in time. Pete shook his head slowly. Girl ain't spoken a word since. 8 months now. Not a single word. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of grief Clara hadn't expected. A silent child. A broken father. A house that had forgotten how to be a home. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you got kind eyes." Pete reached for his hat, settled it on his head. "And because that little girl needs someone with kind eyes to notice her. Even if her daddy's too scared to let anyone close." He left before Clara could respond. So, she found her room as promised, small, clean enough, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a door that locked from the inside. Clara turned that lock 3 times before she believed it, then sat on the bed and let herself shake. Safe. She was safe. For now, at least. The room had a window facing the back of the property. Through it, Clara could see a small garden gone to seed, a chicken coop. And beyond that, the endless Montana sky turning pink with sunset. A movement caught her eye. There at the edge of the garden stood a child, small, dark-haired, wearing a nightgown despite the early hour. She stood utterly still, watching the chickens with an intensity that seemed too heavy for her tiny frame. Rosie. Clara's hand went to the window glass before she could stop herself. The child turned, sensing something, and for one breathless moment their eyes met. Even at this distance, Clara could see it, the rawness, the loneliness, the desperate hunger for something she couldn't name. Then the child ran silent as a ghost, disappearing into the house. Clara sat back down on the bed. Her hands were shaking again, but this time not from fear. "Don't interact with her," Joe had said. "Stay away from my child." But Clara had spent 3 years being told where she could go and who she could speak to. She'd sworn when she ran from Ohio that no man would control her movements again. And yet, this wasn't about control. She could see that now. Joe wasn't trying to hurt his daughter. He was trying to protect her from more loss, more attachment, more people who might leave. He was building walls around Rosie because he didn't know what else to do with his grief. Clara understood walls. She'd built plenty of her own. The first week passed in a rhythm as old as ranching itself. Clara rose before dawn, mixed dough in the darkness, fired up the stove as the first light touched the sky. She learned which hands liked their coffee strong, which avoided eggs, which saved their biscuits for last like they were something precious. She learned the sounds of the house, which floorboards creaked when Joe walked to the barn, when old Pete made his rounds, when the silence meant Rosie was near. The child appeared at odd moments. A flash of dark hair around a corner, a shadow in the doorway that vanished when Clara turned to look. Always watching, never speaking. A ghost in her own home. On the third day, Clara left a biscuit on the back steps. Still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth. By morning, the biscuit was gone. The cloth remained folded neatly. On the fourth day, Clara left a cinnamon roll using sugar she'd found hidden in the back of the pantry. This time, the cloth came back with a small stone placed on top of it. Smooth, gray, deliberately chosen. A gift. The child was leaving gifts. Clara kept that stone in her apron pocket all day, her fingers finding it during quiet moments, running over its smoothness like a prayer. On the fifth day, she left a piece of cornbread with butter melted into its golden center. She found the cloth with a chicken feather, iridescent and beautiful. On the sixth day, Joe caught her. "What are you doing?" Clara froze her hand still on the back door, a fresh biscuit cooling in her other palm. Joe stood in the kitchen doorway, his face hard as the mountains beyond the valley. I told you to stay away from my daughter. I'm not interacting with her." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm leaving food on a step. I don't see her. I don't speak to her. I just make sure she has something warm to eat in the morning." "That's not—" Joe stopped his jaw working. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Then explain it to me." The words hung between them sharper than Clara had intended. She watched something shift in Joe's expression, the anger cracking just slightly to reveal the fear beneath. "People leave," he said finally. "Everyone leaves. Her mother left. The cook before you left. The one before that. Every person Rosie gets attached to, they leave, and she's the one who pays for it. She's the one who stops talking, and stops eating and stares at nothing for days, because someone else decided they couldn't stay." Clara set the biscuit down carefully. "I'm not leaving." "Everyone says that." "I mean it." So did they. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Clara thought about explaining about Silas and Ohio, and 3 years of being told she was worthless and ugly and lucky anyone wanted her at all. About running, not because she wanted to, but because staying meant dying slowly, one piece of herself at a time. But some truths were too heavy to hand to a stranger. "I know what it's like," she said instead, "to lose people, to be afraid of caring because caring just means more chances to be hurt." Joe's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me. I know you hired a cook and forbade her from feeding your hungry child. I know you watch Rosie from across the room like you're afraid to touch her. I know you eat breakfast standing up so you don't have to sit at a table that used to have 4 people at it." Each word landed like a blow. Clara watched Joe flinch, watched his fists clench at his sides, and waited for the explosion. It didn't come. Instead, Joe turned away, his shoulders hunching like a man trying to make himself smaller. "She stopped talking the day Eliza died," he said, his voice barely audible. "I rode for the doctor, but the creek was flooded from storms. By the time I got back, Eliza was gone. Rosie was sitting beside her bed holding her mama's cold hand, and she hasn't said a word since." Clara's heart broke clean in two. "I thought if I kept her away from people from attachment, she'd be safe. She couldn't lose anyone if she didn't love anyone." Joe laughed hollow and bitter. "But she's not safe. She's just alone, and I don't know how to fix it." "You can't fix grief," Clara said softly. You can only hold it until it decides to let go. Joe turned back to face her. The mask was gone now, stripped away by words neither of them had planned to speak. He looked exhausted, defeated, human. The biscuits, he said. She really eats them. Every morning, and leaves me presents, stones, feathers, a dried flower once. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across Joe's face. She used to collect things like that. For Eliza. Would bring them in from the garden like they were treasures. They are treasures. To a child who has nothing else to give. Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then, keep leaving the biscuits. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. But don't... He stopped, swallowed hard. Don't make me regret trusting you. He left before she could answer. Clara stood in the kitchen, the morning light warming her face, and felt something shift in the architecture of her fear. Maybe running wasn't the only option. Maybe sometimes you could stand still long enough to build something worth protecting. She went back to her bread. The summer days grew longer and hotter, and the gifts from Rosie grew bolder. A sketch drawn in charcoal, crude but recognizable, showing a woman with an apron and a biscuit in her hand. A ribbon that must have come from an old dress, frayed at the edges, but still blue enough to catch light. A note with nothing written on it, just the impression of a small hand pressed into the paper. Clara kept everything. She didn't know when she'd started caring so much, only that she couldn't seem to stop. You're different, old Pete observed one morning, watching her knead dough with more force than necessary. Week ago, you jumped every time someone came up behind you. Now you just look up. I'm settling in. Pete didn't sound convinced. Or you're finding reasons to stay. Clara's hands stilled. What's that supposed to mean? Means I've got eyes, girl. Means I see how you look at that little one when you think nobody's watching. Means I see how Joe looks at you when he thinks nobody's watching. Pete leaned against the counter, his old face creasing into something like a smile. There's been too much grief in this house. Too much silence. You're changing that. I'm just cooking. You're doing a hell of a lot more than cooking. He pushed off from the counter, heading for the door. Question is whether you're ready to admit it to yourself. Clara went back to her bread and tried not to think about what she was admitting. She saw Rosie properly for the first time on the morning of her second week. The child appeared in the kitchen doorway, actually appeared not as a shadow or a flicker, but as a solid presence standing in the morning light. Clara's hands froze in the mixing bowl. Rosie stared at her with eyes too old for her 5-year-old face. Dark hair tangled from sleep. Nightgown worn soft from too many washings. Feet bare on the cold floor. Good morning, Clara said softly, carefully, like the child was a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. Rosie didn't speak. Of course she didn't speak. But she didn't run either. Clara went back to mixing, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. I'm making biscuits, she said, narrating for no reason except that silence felt wrong. Your papa hired me to cook for the ranch hands. They eat a lot. Much more than one little girl, I'd wager. Rosie took a step closer. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Would you like to help? I could use someone to hand me the flour? Another step. Then another. And then Rosie was beside her, small and solemn, and reaching for the flour sack with hands that trembled slightly. They worked together in silence. Clara mixed, Rosie handed ingredients, neither of them acknowledging the magnitude of what was happening. By the time the biscuits went into the oven, Rosie was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing patterns in the flour dust with her finger. Those are pretty, Clara said. Are they flowers? Rosie shook her head. Drew another line. Stars. A nod this time. Something flickering in those dark eyes that might have been pride. I like stars, Clara said. When I was a little girl, my grandmother used to tell me that stars were the souls of people who'd gone on, that they watched over us from the sky. Rosie's hand stopped moving. She looked up at Clara with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way to the bone. "Is that what you believe?" Clara asked. "That your mama is up there watching?" The child's chin trembled. Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, and then, slowly, carefully, she nodded. Clara knelt beside the table, bringing herself to Rosie's level. "Then she sees everything you do. Every time you're brave, and every time you're scared. Every biscuit you eat, and every gift you leave." She reached out, brushed a strand of hair from the child's face. "She sees you, Rosie, and she loves you. Nothing changes that." Rosie's small arms wrapped around Clara's neck with desperate strength. The child buried her face against Clara's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs, all that grief finally finding somewhere safe to land. Clara held her. Just held her. That was how Joe found them kneeling on the kitchen floor, wrapped around each other, while biscuits burned forgotten in the oven, and morning light poured through dusty windows. He stood in the doorway, frozen. Clara looked up and saw it all cross his face, the fear, the anger, the desperate hope he was trying to pretend he didn't feel. "She came to me," Clara said quietly. "I didn't go looking. She came." Joe's throat worked. His eyes stayed fixed on his daughter, small and vulnerable, and holding on to someone for the first time in 8 months. "Rosie," he said. Just her name. Just that one word, broken and tender. The child lifted her head from Clara's shoulder. She looked at her father. She looked at Clara. Then she reached out one small hand toward Joe, her meaning unmistakable. "Come here. I want you both." Joe crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. He knelt beside them, his arms going around them both, pulling Clara and Rosie against his chest like they were something precious that might slip away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so damn sorry, baby girl. I thought I was protecting you. I didn't know how to—" Rosie pressed her hand against his cheek, still silent, but communicating more in that gesture than words could ever carry. They stayed there until the smoke alarm went off, and Clara had to jump up to rescue what remained of the biscuits. But something had shifted. Something had cracked open that couldn't be closed again. That night, Joe found Clara in the kitchen after supper, washing dishes by lamplight. "She's asleep," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "First time she's slept through sunset without nightmares in months." "Good. She needed rest." Joe was quiet for a moment. Then, "What you did today, with Rosie?" "I didn't do anything. I just let her come to me." "That's everything." He pushed off from the frame, moved closer. "I've been trying so hard to keep her safe that I forgot she needed to heal. You showed me that. You showed her." Clara dried her hands slowly, not meeting his eyes. "I know what it's like. To need someone and not have the words for it. To be afraid that if you let people in, they'll just hurt you more." "What happened to you?" The question hung in the warm kitchen air. Clara could deflect, could lie, could add another stone to the walls she'd built around herself. Instead, she said, "There was a man, in Ohio. My uncle owed him money, so he arranged things. I was part of the payment." Joe's expression went hard. Arranged things. Marriage, or what he called marriage. 3 years of being told I was worthless, that no one else would ever want me, that I should be grateful anyone paid attention to a woman who looked like me. Clara's voice stayed flat, detached, reciting facts from someone else's life. "When I tried to leave the first time, he broke 2 of my ribs. When I tried the second time, he told me what he'd do to anyone who helped me." "But you got out." "He went to Denver on business. I took what I could carry and ran, changed my name, changed states, changed everything." Clara finally looked at him. "I thought if I got far enough, if I stayed invisible enough, I could disappear. But I'm starting to think running isn't the answer." "What is the answer?" "I don't know. But I'm tired of being afraid. And I'm tired of building walls that keep everyone out, including the people who might be worth letting in. Joe moved closer, still close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, the pulse beating at his throat. "Rosie needs you," he said. "This ranch needs you." Clara's breath caught. "And you—" "I don't know what I need." His hand came up, hesitated, then settled on her shoulder with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "But I know I'm glad you're here, and I know I don't want you to leave." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was something more honest, an admission of uncertainty, of fear, of hope, that didn't quite know how to hope yet. Clara understood that perfectly. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not until I find something worth leaving for. And I'm starting to think I might not find that anywhere else." Joe nodded slowly. His hand slid from her shoulder to her jaw, tilting her face up. For one breathless moment, Clara thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Joe." He left her standing in the kitchen with dirty dishes and dangerous hope, and the growing conviction that she'd found something worth standing still for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The summer was far from over, and somewhere in Ohio a man was surely searching for the woman who'd dared to escape him. But tonight, Clara Sullivan slept without nightmares for the first time in 3 years. And in the room above her, a little girl dreamed of stars and biscuits, and a woman with kind eyes who had finally come to stay. 3 weeks into her time at the Callahan Ranch, Clara stopped counting the days until she could leave. She started counting the reasons she might want to stay. Rosie appeared in the kitchen every morning now. Never at the same time, never announced, just suddenly there like a small ghost who'd learned that haunting could be a comfort instead of a curse. She didn't speak. Clara had stopped expecting her to, but she listened. Lord, how that child listened. "Flour first," Clara said, demonstrating for the dozenth time. "Then salt. Then the buttermilk, but slowly. You rush the buttermilk, you ruin the biscuits." Rosie nodded solemnly, her small hands covered in flour up to the wrists. "My grandmother taught me this recipe. She said biscuits were honest. You can't lie to bread. It knows if you're rushing, if you're angry, if you're sad. It rises or it doesn't, and there's no arguing with it." The child tilted her head considering this. She also said the best biscuits come from happy hands. So we think good thoughts while we mix. Clara smiled. "What are you thinking about, sweet girl?" Rosie pointed at herself, then at Clara, then pressed her flour-covered hands together like a prayer. "You're thinking about us, about baking together." A nod. A smile so fragile it nearly broke Clara's heart. "That's a good thought. That's the best kind." The back door opened. Joe stood there, his work gloves in one hand, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something softer. "Morning, Papa," Clara said, then caught herself. The word had slipped out natural as breathing. "I mean, Mr. Callahan, Joe." But Rosie was already running to her father, holding up her flour-covered hands for inspection. Joe knelt down, examined them with exaggerated seriousness. "Well now," he said, "looks like someone's been working hard." Rosie nodded vigorously. "These the hands of a real baker." Another nod. "Then I reckon I'll be expecting the best biscuits in Montana territory this morning." Rosie grabbed his sleeve and tugged, pulling him toward the table where Clara stood frozen, still embarrassed by her slip of the tongue. Joe let himself be led, his eyes finding Clara's over his daughter's head. "Don't stop on my account," he said. "Looks like you two have a system." "She's a good helper." "She's something all right." Joe's voice went rough. "Something I didn't know I was missing." They finished the biscuits together, all 3 of them, the first time Joe had stayed in the kitchen since Clara arrived. He was hopeless with dough, his big hands better suited to roping cattle than shaping bread, but Rosie giggled silently at his misshapen attempts, and Clara found herself laughing out loud, and the sound echoed off the walls like it had been waiting years for someone to set it free. Old Pete appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and grinned around his tobacco. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Ain't seen this kitchen full of noise since—" He stopped himself. Since a long time. Just making breakfast, Joe said, but he didn't move away from the table. Uh-huh. That what the kids are calling it these days? Pete? Just saying. The old foreman winked at Clara. Mighty nice to hear laughing in this house again. Mighty nice indeed. He left before Joe could respond. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was full of things unsaid. Clara busied herself with the oven. Joe helped Rosie wash her hands at the pump. And somewhere in the space between them, something was building that neither of them was ready to name. The ranch hands noticed the change. They'd have been blind not to. Rosie started appearing at breakfast, sitting beside Clara, instead of eating alone in her room. She didn't speak to the men, but she watched them with curiosity instead of fear. And more than one hardened cowboy found himself speaking softer, moving, gentler in the presence of the silent child, who seemed to see everything. She's getting better, Sarah Beth Harper said one afternoon, stopping by the kitchen with her 2 young boys in tow. Her husband had been one of the ranch hands. He'd died in a cattle stampede the winter before. She lived in a small cabin on the edge of the property, helping with mending and laundry. Everyone's noticed. Clara kneaded bread with more force than necessary. She's just spending time in the kitchen. She's spending time with you. There's a difference. I'm just the cook. Sarah Beth laughed, a sound too knowing for comfort. Honey, you stopped being just the cook about 2 weeks ago. The way Joe looks at you when you're not watching, that ain't how a man looks at hired help. He doesn't. He does. And you look back the same way, even if you're too stubborn to admit it. Clara's hands stilled. I can't. I'm not. There's things you don't know. We all got things. Sarah Beth's voice gentled. Question is whether we let those things keep us from living or whether we figure out how to live anyway. She left Clara with that thought and a pound of butter she'd churned that morning. The first real trouble came on a Thursday 3.5 weeks after Clara's arrival. She was hanging laundry behind the house when the rider approached. Fine clothes, fine horse. The kind of man who wore his money like armor. He dismounted with practiced ease, his eyes sweeping the property with an expression that made Clara's skin crawl. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. I'm looking for Josiah Callahan. He's in the north pasture. Won't be back until supper time. And you are? Clara straightened her spine. The cook. The cook. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement or contempt, she couldn't tell which. Well, cook, you tell Callahan that Judge Harold Mercer stopped by. Tell him I'll be back tomorrow to discuss our arrangement. What arrangement would that be? The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's between me and Callahan. But you might mention that I'm running out of patience. A man can only wait so long for what he's owed. He rode off without waiting for a response. Clara found Joe at supper, pulled him aside while the hands were still eating. A man came by today, called himself Judge Mercer. Joe's face went hard. What did he want? Wouldn't say, just that you had an arrangement and he's running out of patience. Joe swore under his breath a word Clara pretended not to hear. That snake's been circling this ranch since Eliza died. Claims I owe him for water rights, says there's some contract from the previous owner. I've been putting him off, but he's got power in this territory. The kind that comes from money and connections and not caring who gets hurt. Joe rubbed his face with both hands. I can't afford whatever he's asking. Not with the cattle prices the way they are. Not with... He stopped, but Clara heard what he didn't say. Not with 2 years of grief and a silent daughter and a ranch slowly falling apart around him. How much does he want? $3,000. Might as well be $3 million. Clara thought of the money Silas had controlled, the inheritance her parents had left, the wages she'd never been allowed to touch. All of it gone. All of it stolen by the man who'd treated her like property. There has to be another way. Maybe, but I ain't found it yet. Joe's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw fear in them. This ranch is all I've got left. All Rosie's got left. If Mercer takes it, he won't. The words came out fierce, surprising them both. "We won't let him." "We—" Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I mean you. You won't let him." But Joe was already looking at her differently. Like she'd said something that mattered. Like "we" meant more than she'd intended. "We," he repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Rosie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and the spell broke. "Hey there, baby girl," Joe said, scooping her up. "Bad dream." Rosie shook her head, pointed at Clara. "You wanted Clara." A nod. Joe looked at Clara over his daughter's head. "Seems you're in demand. I'll sit with her until she falls back asleep." "You don't have to. I want to." She followed them up the stairs to Rosie's room, a small space filled with dolls and drawings, and the particular chaos of childhood. Rosie settled into bed, reached for Clara's hand, and held on like she never planned to let go. "Would you like a song?" Clara asked. Rosie nodded. Clara sang. An old hymn her grandmother had taught her about green pastures and still waters and walking through valleys without fear. Her voice wasn't beautiful, but it was steady, and Rosie's eyes grew heavy before the second verse was done. Joe watched from the doorway. When Clara finally slipped her hand free and stood, he was still there. "You're good with her," he said quietly. "She's easy to love." "Not everyone finds it easy. Not everyone tries." They stood in the narrow hallway, close enough that Clara could feel the heat of him, smell the leather and sage that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Joe." "I know," he said. "I know it's too fast, too soon, too everything. But Clara, I haven't felt anything in 2 years, not since Eliza. And then you showed up at my door 3 days late with a worn-out carpetbag and something just—" He shook his head. "Something woke up." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm not what you think I am." "What do I think you are?" "Someone whole, someone without a past, someone who can just—" "Everyone's got a past. What matters is what we do with the future." He reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, too gentle. The kind of gentleness that could undo her completely if she let it. "I need time," she whispered. "I've got time. Got nothing but time." He stepped back, giving her space she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Joe." She went to her room and didn't sleep for hours. The summer heat built toward something. Clara felt it in the way the air thickened, the way the cattle grew restless, the way old Pete watched the sky with the wariness of a man who'd seen too many Montana storms to take sunshine for granted. "Big one coming," he said on the morning of her 4th week. "Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but it's coming." Clara thought of Rosie, of what Pete had told her about Eliza dying in a storm, of the terror that must live in that small child's heart, waiting for thunder to bring it roaring back. How bad? Bad enough. Pete spat tobacco juice. "You make sure that little girl knows where you are when it hits. She's gonna need someone. She has her father. Her father's gonna be out there saving cattle and horses and everything else a rancher's gotta save when nature decides to throw a fit. That child needs someone who'll stay with her, someone she trusts." Clara nodded slowly. "I'll be here." "I know you will." Pete's weathered face creased into something like affection. "That's why I'm telling you." The storm announced itself at noon, with a sky the color of bruises. Clara had just pulled bread from the oven when the first thunder rolled across the valley, distant but promising violence. Joe appeared in the kitchen doorway, already pulling on his coat. "I've got to get to the herd. We've got cattle scattered across the north pasture and they'll panic when the lightning starts." "Go. I'll handle things here." "Rosie." "I've got her. Go." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, pulled Clara against him, and kissed her forehead with a fierce tenderness that stole her breath. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Then he was gone, and the house felt suddenly enormous in his absence. Clara found Rosie in the parlor, pressed against the window, watching the sky darken. The child's small body was rigid with fear she couldn't express. "Hey there," Clara said softly, kneeling beside her. "Storm's coming." Rosie nodded. Her hands were shaking. "You scared?" Another nod, smaller this time. "That's okay. Being scared is okay." Clara pulled the child into her arms. "Tell you what, let's go to the kitchen. We'll bake something while we wait for the rain. Storms aren't so scary when your hands are busy." They made it as far as the flour bin before the first lightning cracked across the sky. Rosie screamed not a word, just a raw sound of terror, and bolted. "Rosie! Rosie! Wait!" But the child was already out the back door, running into the approaching storm, like something was chasing her that only she could see. Clara ran after her. The wind hit her like a wall, hot and fierce and full of dust. She lost sight of Rosie almost immediately, the girl's small form swallowed by the chaos of the approaching storm. "Rosie!" Clara screamed. "Rosie, where are you?" Thunder answered. Lightning split the sky. Clara ran toward the barn, the only shelter close enough for a frightened child to reach. The doors were open, banging in the wind. She fought her way inside, calling Rosie's name until her throat burned. She found her in the far corner, curled into a ball behind the hay bales, her arms wrapped around her knees and her face pressed into the dusty darkness. The horses were wild-eyed and stamping, adding their panic to the chaos. "Rosie!" Clara dropped to her knees beside the child. "Rosie, sweetheart, I'm here." The girl didn't respond, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Clara's presence at all. Clara gathered her up anyway, pulled that small, rigid body against her chest, and held on. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you. You're not alone. You're never alone." The storm broke overhead. Rain hammered the barn roof like fists. Lightning turned the world white again and again, followed by thunder so loud Clara felt it in her teeth. And through it all, Rosie screamed. Not words, just screams, raw and broken, all the terror she'd been holding for 8 months, finally finding its way out. Clara started to sing, the same hymn from Rosie's bedroom. Her voice cracked and wavered, no match for the storm's fury, but she sang anyway. Kept singing through the thunder and the lightning and the child's desperate grip on her neck. Slowly, so slowly, Rosie's screams faded to sobs. The sobs faded to shaking. The shaking faded to exhaustion. Clara kept singing. She didn't hear Joe approach, didn't know he was there until she looked up and saw him standing in the barn doorway, soaked to the bone, his face a wreckage of fear and relief, and something else, something that looked like awe. "I told you to stay away from her." His voice was barely audible over the rain. Clara held Rosie tighter. "I know. I gave you rules, clear rules." "You did." "Then why—" The word cracked. "Why couldn't you just let her be—" "Because she needed someone." Clara met his eyes without flinching. "And I was here." Joe stood there for a long moment. Rain dripped from his hat, his coat, his hands. He looked like a man fighting himself, losing and not caring anymore. Then he crossed the barn and knelt beside them in the hay. "Her mother died in a storm like this," he said. "Went into labor early. I rode for the doctor, but I couldn't make it through the flooding. By the time I got back—" His voice broke. She was gone, and Rosie was sitting beside the bed holding her hand, not understanding why Mama wouldn't wake up. Clara's heart shattered. "Oh, Joe. I thought if I kept her away from the storms, away from anything that might remind her—" He shook his head. "I thought I was protecting her, but she stopped talking, stopped sleeping, stopped being the little girl I knew, and I didn't know how to bring her back." Rosie stirred in Clara's arms. Her eyes opened, found her father's face, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. Then she reached out one small hand and pressed it against Joe's cheek. "She's forgiving you," Clara whispered. I don't deserve. That's not how forgiveness works. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn, something was healing. Joe gathered them both up his arms, wrapped around Clara and Rosie together, his face buried in his daughter's hair. "Thank you," he said. "God, Clara, thank you." They stayed that way until the rain began to ease, until the thunder retreated to distant grumbles, until Rosie fell asleep with her head on Clara's shoulder and her hand still pressed against her father's heart. When they finally made it back to the house carrying Rosie between them, something had changed. Clara felt it in the way Joe looked at her, in the way his hand found hers in the darkness, in the way he said her name like it was something precious. "Stay," he said, standing in the kitchen while water pooled around their feet. "Not just as the cook, not just as hired help. Stay." "Joe, I know you're running from something. I don't need to know what. I just need to know you'll give this a chance. Give us a chance." Clara thought about Ohio, about Silas, about 3 years of being told she was worthless, and 8 months of running, and all the fear she'd carried across 3 states. Then she looked at Rosie asleep and peaceful for the first time since her mother died. At Joe broken and beautiful, and brave enough to ask for what he wanted. "I'll stay," she said. Joe kissed her then, really kissed her with rain still dripping from his hair, and his daughter safe between them, and the whole future stretching out like the Montana sky, wild and terrifying, and full of possibility. "Mama." They both froze. The word was barely a whisper, rough from disuse, but unmistakable. Rosie's eyes were open. She was looking at Clara. "Mama," she said again. Joe made a sound that might have been a sob. Clara's tears fell before she could stop them. And Rosie. Precious, silent, wounded. Rosie smiled for the first time in 8 months. "That's right, baby girl," Joe said, his voice wrecked. "That's your mama now, if she'll have us." Clara pulled them both close. This man and his daughter, who'd somehow become everything she didn't know she needed. "I'll have you," she said. "Both of you. Forever." Outside, the storm had passed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Judge Mercer's threats, the ranch's uncertain future, the shadow of Clara's past still lurking somewhere in Ohio. But tonight, in a farmhouse kitchen in Montana, a family was being born. Not from blood, not from obligation, from something stronger. From choice, from courage, from love that had found its way home. The word spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. The silent Callahan girl had spoken. Not just spoken, she'd called the new cook Mama, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Clara heard the whispers when she went to town for supplies, saw the knowing looks, felt the weight of a community's curiosity pressing against her from all sides. "Folks are talking," old Pete said, loading flour sacks into the wagon. "Good talking mostly, some not so good." "What kind of not so good?" "The kind that wonders where you came from and why a woman alone ends up in Montana territory looking for cooking work." Pete spat tobacco juice. "The kind that notices you don't get mail and don't talk about family and jump every time a stranger rides into town." Clara's hands tightened on the reins. "People should mind their own business." "They should. They don't. That's just how it is." Pete climbed up beside her, his old bones creaking. "I'm not asking questions, understand. Just warning you. Someone's been in town asking about a woman matching your description. Said he was working for a concerned family member back east." Clara's blood went cold. "When?" "2 days ago. Talked to the postmaster, the hotel clerk, couple of the shopkeepers. Nobody told him nothing useful. We protect our own out here, but he ain't stopped looking." "What did he look like?" "City type. Fancy suit, soft hands. The kind that gets paid to find people who don't want to be found." Silas. It had to be. He'd sent someone to track her down, and that someone was getting close. "Does Joe know?" "Told him this morning. He's the one who asked me to tell you." Pete's voice gentled. He wants you to know you're not alone in this, whatever this is. He's ready to fight for you." Clara stared at the road ahead, her heart pounding. He doesn't know what he'd be fighting? Then maybe you should tell him. That night, after Rosie was asleep and the ranch hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, Clara found Joe on the porch. He was staring at the stars like they held answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. "Pete told me about the man in town," she said, settling beside him. "I figured he would. Joe, there are things I should have told you, things that might make you regret." "I don't regret anything." He turned to face her, his eyes fierce in the moonlight. "But I need to know what I'm up against. Not because it'll change how I feel, because I need to know how to protect you." Clara's throat tightened. 3 years with Silas, and he'd never once talked about protecting her. He'd talked about owning her, controlling her, making sure she knew her place. "His name is Silas Garrett," she said. "He's from Cincinnati. My uncle owed him money gambling debts that kept piling up no matter how much he paid. One day Silas came to collect, and my uncle didn't have the money, so he offered something else instead." "You?" "Me. I was 24, plain as mud, and too grateful for any attention to see the trap closing around me. Silas said all the right things at first. Made me feel special. Made me feel wanted." Clara's voice hardened. "Then we got married, and everything changed." Joe's hands clenched into fists. "What did he do to you?" "Everything. Nothing. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. He controlled the money, the house, who I could see and when. He told me what to wear, what to eat, how to speak. And when I didn't obey..." She stopped, swallowed. "There are scars. Some you can see, some you can't." "Clara, he broke 2 of my ribs the first time I tried to leave. Told me if I ever tried again, he'd make sure I couldn't walk. And I believed him. For 2 more years I believed him." Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and shameful. "Then he went to Denver on business, and I finally found the courage to run. I've been running ever since." Joe was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough as unfinished timber. "This man, this Silas, if he comes here, he will. The detective Pete mentioned that Silas is doing. He won't stop until he finds me. He doesn't lose. He doesn't let go of what he considers his." "You're not his." "I know that now, but he doesn't." Joe stood, pulled her up with him, and wrapped his arms around her with a fierceness that stole her breath. "Listen to me," he said against her hair. "You're not running anymore. This is your home now. Rosie needs you. I need you. And I will put a bullet in any man who tries to take you away from us." "Joe." "I mean it, Clara. I've buried 2 wives. I've watched my daughter go silent with grief. I am not losing you too. Not to some bastard from Ohio. Not to anyone." Clara held on to him and let herself believe just for a moment that he was strong enough to keep that promise. The idea came to her at dawn, while she was kneading bread and watching Rosie draw pictures at the kitchen table. If she couldn't run, and she couldn't hide, maybe she could build something strong enough to protect. Something that would give her options, independence, a way to survive if everything fell apart. "Joe," she said at breakfast, "what if I started selling bread, not just to the ranch hands, to the mining camps, the settlements? There's no bakery between here and Helena. Men are desperate for anything that reminds them of home." Joe set down his coffee, considering. "You're talking about a business. I'm talking about income. Money that could help with Mercer's demands. Money that would be mine, ours, not dependent on cattle prices or water rights or anything else someone could take away. It's a lot of work. More than what you're already doing." "I'm not afraid of work." Clara met his eyes. "I'm afraid of being helpless, of having no options when trouble comes. Let me do this. Let me contribute more than just meals." Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Old Pete knows every camp and settlement within 50 miles. He can help you plan routes, figure out pricing. If you're serious about this, I've never been more serious about anything in my life." "Then do it. Build something. Show this territory what you're made of." Clara kissed him quick and fierce, right there in the kitchen with Rosie watching and the ranch hands about to come in for breakfast. Joe made a sound of surprise that turned into something warmer, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Mama kissed Papa," Rosie announced, her voice still rough from disuse, but growing stronger every day. Clara laughed against Joe's mouth. "I did. Is that okay?" "Do it again." They were still laughing when old Pete appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and turned right back around. "I'll come back later," he called over his shoulder. "Much later." The business started small. Clara baked extra loaves and Pete took them to the nearest mining camp in the ranch wagon. They sold out in 20 minutes. The next week, she doubled the quantity, still sold out. By the third week, men were placing orders in advance, and Clara was hiring Sarah Beth Harper to help with the mixing. "Word's spreading," Pete reported after their 5th delivery run. "Miners are talking about your bread like it's made of gold. They're asking about pies, cakes, anything sweet. Some of them haven't tasted proper baking in years." "Can we keep up with demand?" "Not the way we're going now. But if we built another oven, brought on more help?" He trailed off, watching her face. "You're thinking bigger than bread, ain't you? I'm thinking about survival." Clara wiped flour from her hands. "Mercer's deadline is coming. Joe's scrambling to sell cattle at prices that won't cover half what he owes. If this business can bring in real money, you'd be saving the ranch. I'd be saving all of us." Pete nodded slowly. "I'll talk to the boys. See who's got wives or daughters who might want work. We'll need a second oven built, more supplies coming in regular. It's gonna take everything you've got." "Then it's a good thing I've got everything to give." The money started flowing in. Not enough to solve all their problems, but enough to matter. Enough to give Clara hope. But hope, she'd learned, was always followed by fear. The stranger appeared at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty from travel, and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Clara saw him from the kitchen window, and her blood froze solid in her veins. She knew that face. Had seen it at parties in Cincinnati, hovering near Silas, doing whatever dirty work needed doing. Thomas Pike, Silas's fixer. The man who made problems disappear. Clara's hands shook as she pulled off her apron. She slipped out. The back door crept around the side of the house and listened. "Looking for a woman who might have passed through a few months back," Pike was saying to Joe. "Round-billed auburn hair, goes by different names. Her family's worried sick. She's not well, you understand. Prone to delusions. They just want to bring her home where she can get proper care." "No one matching that description here," Joe said. His voice was flat. Dangerous. "This is a cattle ranch, not a way station for lost women." Of course. But you understand, I have to be thorough. The husband, poor man, he's beside himself. Hasn't slept in weeks, wondering if his wife is safe." "His wife?" "Yes, Mrs. Silas Garrett. Lovely woman, truly. Such a tragedy, her illness. The thing she believes well." Pike's voice dripped with false sympathy. "She tells people her husband hurt her. Can you imagine a man of his standing, his reputation? But that's the delusion, you see. She can't tell fantasy from reality anymore." Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. "I'll tell you what I told the last man who came here asking questions." Joe said, his voice now cold as winter. "I don't know anyone by that name. I don't have time for city folk and their problems. And if I see you on my property again without an invitation, I'll consider it trespassing and act accordingly." "There's no need for hostility, Mr. Callahan. I'm simply... Get off my land." Silence. Then hoofbeats retreating. Clara stayed pressed against the wall until she was sure Pike was gone. When Joe found her there, shaking and pale, he didn't ask questions. He just pulled her inside, sat her down at the kitchen table, and poured her whiskey from the bottle he kept hidden in the pantry. "He'll send word back to Silas," Clara said, her voice hollow. "He'll tell him where I am. It's over." "Nothing's over." You don't understand. Silas has money connections. He can make people believe anything. Did you hear what Pike said? That I'm delusional, that I made up the abuse. That's the story he's spreading, and people will believe it because Silas is rich and respectable, and you're just what? Joe crouched beside her chair, forced her to meet his eyes. Say it. What are you? Nothing. Nobody. A woman who was stupid enough to marry a monster and too weak to leave for 3 years. No. Joe's voice was fierce. You're the woman who had the courage to escape, who traveled 1,000 miles to start over, who made my daughter speak again, who's building a business from nothing. You're not weak, Clara. You're the strongest person I know. It won't matter. When Silas comes, he'll find out that Clara Sullivan belongs to this ranch, this community, this family. He'll find out that we protect our own out here, and he'll find out what happens to men who try to take what isn't theirs. Clara wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe. Marry me, Joe said. Clara's heart stopped. What? Marry me. Tomorrow. Before Silas gets here, before Pike can report back, before any of it. Make it legal. Make it real. Make it so that man has no claim on you, no right to take you anywhere, no power over your life. That's not Joe. You can't marry me just to protect me from... I'm not marrying you to protect you. He took her hands, held them tight. I'm marrying you because I love you. Because Rosie loves you. Because this house has been a home again since you walked through that door. The protection is just a bonus. You love me. I love you. He said it simply, certainly like stating the color of the sky. I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. But Clara, I've lived through enough loss to know when something's worth fighting for. And you're worth fighting for. So marry me. Stay with me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving I deserve you. Clara looked at this man, this broken, beautiful man who'd lost so much and was still willing to risk his heart again. She thought about running, about disappearing, about spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder waiting for Silas to find her. Then she thought about Rosie calling her mama, about bread rising in the oven, about building something real with her own 2 hands. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. Joe's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He kissed her deep and thorough, and Clara let herself believe that love might be stronger than fear after all. They married 3 days later in the ranch parlor with old Pete and Sarah Beth as witnesses, and Rosie scattering wildflowers at their feet. It was simple. It was perfect. It was the first choice Clara had made in years that belonged entirely to her. But even as she spoke her vows, even as Joe slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she knew the peace wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, Silas Garrett was getting a telegram, learning exactly where his property had run to. The storm was coming. Clara could feel it building, same as she'd felt the summer storm that had changed everything. This time, she wouldn't run. This time she'd stand and fight, even if it cost her everything. Judge Mercer came calling the day after the wedding. He rode up with 2 men flanking him, their hands resting on their gun belts in a way that made the message clear. Congratulations on your nuptials, he said, not sounding congratulatory at all. I hear you married well, Mrs. Callahan. A ranch with water rights cattle land. Quite the catch for a woman who arrived in town with nothing but a carpet bag. State your business, Mercer, Joe said, positioning himself between Clara and the visitors. My business is the $3,000 you owe me, payable in 30 days. I believe I've been more than patient. That debt is disputed. The contract you're claiming is perfectly legal. I have lawyers who'll swear to it. Now I'm a reasonable man. I don't want to take your ranch, but a man's got to get what he's owed. Mercer's smile was thin and cold. Pay up or face the consequences. And if I can't pay, then I'll file for seizure. The territory courts move fast these days. You'll be off this land by winter. Mercer's eyes slid to Clara, and something ugly flickered in them. Of course there might be alternative arrangements. A new wife looking for security. A man of my position looking for certain companionship. Joe moved so fast, Clara barely saw it. One moment he was standing still. The next he had Mercer by the throat, dragging him off his horse and slamming him against the porch post. "You say one more word about my wife," Joe growled, "and I'll break every bone in your body. You understand me?" Mercer's men reached for their guns, but old Pete appeared on the porch with a rifle, and suddenly the odds didn't look so good for the visitors. "I'd think twice about that," Pete said calmly. "We got 6 more rifles in that bunkhouse, and boys who know how to use them." Mercer raised his hands in surrender. "No need for violence. I was simply making conversation." Joe released him, shoving him backward. "Get off my land, and don't come back unless you want to finish this conversation differently." Mercer straightened his coat, his face flushed with humiliation and fury. 30 days, Callahan. Not a day more. And when you can't pay—" He glanced at Clara one more time. "We'll see who ends up with what." He rode off with his men trailing behind. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, her heart hammering. "Joe, he won't touch you." Joe knelt beside her, his hands gentle despite the violence still coiling in his muscles. "I swear to God, Clara, that man will never lay a finger on you." "It's not just him." Clara looked up, met his eyes. "It's everything. Mercer, Silas, all of it. We're surrounded by enemies and we're running out of time. Then we fight harder." Joe pulled her to her feet. "The bakery business is growing. If we push, really push, we might be able to raise enough to pay Mercer off. And when Silas comes, we'll be ready for him too." Clara said it with more confidence than she felt. But she'd made her choice. She'd married this man. She'd claimed this life. And she would burn the world down before she let anyone take it away from her. The rider appeared at sunset 3 days before Mercer's deadline. Clara was in the kitchen going over accounts with Sarah Beth when Rosie ran in screaming, "Mama, Mama, bad man!" Clara dropped her papers. "What bad man, where?" But she knew. She knew before she even reached the window. She knew by the quality of fear in Rosie's voice, by the way her own body went cold and still. Silas Garrett sat on his fine horse in the middle of the ranch yard. He was dressed for travel, his clothes dusty but expensive. And he was smiling. That same smile he'd worn on their wedding day. The smile that promised pain. "Hello, darling," he called out, spotting her in the window. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" Clara's feet carried her to the door before her mind could stop them. Every instinct screamed to hide, to run, to disappear out the back, and keep running until Montana was just another state she'd left behind. But Rosie was clutching her skirt, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard Joe's voice promising that she wasn't alone anymore. She stepped onto the porch. Silas dismounted with the easy grace she remembered. He looked exactly the same, handsome in that polished way, his smile warm for anyone watching. Only Clara knew what lived behind that smile. Only she knew the monster wearing the gentleman's mask. "There you are, darling." His voice carried across the yard, sweet as poison. "You've led me on quite the chase. 3 states, 8 months. Do you have any idea what I've spent trying to find you? I'm not going back." "Of course you are. You're my wife." "I was never your wife. Not in any way that mattered." Silas's smile flickered just for a moment. Then it was back, wider than before. "You're confused, my love. The doctors warned me this might happen. Your delusions, your fantasies about abuse that never occurred. But I'm here now. I'll take you home where you can get proper treatment." The door behind Clara opened. Joe stepped out, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You must be Silas Garrett. And you must be the rancher who's been harboring my wife." Silas's eyes swept over Joe with barely concealed contempt. "I don't blame you, friend. She's very convincing when she wants to be. But I'm sure you understand a man has a right to his own property." "Clara isn't property. She's a free woman." "Clara?" Silas laughed softly. "Is that what she's calling herself now? Her name is Lena Garrett. We've been married 3 years and I have documentation to prove it. And I have documentation showing she's Clara Callahan now. My wife. Married legal and proper right here in Montana territory. The smile finally died on Silas's face. His eyes went flat and cold, the way Clara remembered from the worst nights. That marriage isn't valid. She was already married to me. Any judge in the country can also recognize abuse when they see the evidence. Joe's voice was steel. Broken ribs, bruises, witness testimony from Ohio. You want to take this to court, Garrett, because I'd love to see you try explaining why your wife ran 1,000 miles to escape you. Lies. All lies. She's mentally unstable, prone to... Stop. Clara's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stepped forward, placing herself between Joe and Silas. Stop pretending. Stop performing. There's no audience here to convince. Silas's mask slipped further. Lena. My name is Clara Sullivan Callahan, and I am done being afraid of you. She was shaking. Her whole body trembled with terror that hadn't faded in 8 months of running. But her voice held steady, and her eyes never left his. You hit me, she said. You broke my ribs. You locked me in the house for weeks at a time. You controlled every dollar, every friendship, every moment of my life. You told me I was worthless, that no one else would ever want me, that I should be grateful you bothered to look at someone as fat and ugly as me. I was trying to help you. I needed love. I needed kindness. I needed a husband who saw me as a person instead of something to own. Clara's voice cracked, but she kept going. I didn't get any of that from you. All I got was pain and fear, and 3 years of believing I deserved it. You ungrateful... But I don't believe it anymore. She straightened her spine, squared her shoulders. I know my worth now. I've built a business. I've become a mother to a child who needed me. I've married a man who treats me like an equal instead of a prisoner. I have a life, Silas. A real life. And you have no part in it. Silas moved fast. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, fingers digging into the bone exactly where the old bruises had faded. You think you can just leave me, walk away and start over like I'm nothing? I own you, Lena. I paid for you. Your worthless uncle gave you to me to cover his debts, and I will collect what I'm owed. The pain was familiar. Clara had felt it 100 times before, but this time, instead of shrinking, she looked Silas dead in the eye. Let go of me. Or what, your cowboy will shoot me in front of witnesses. He'll hang for murder, and you'll have no one left to protect you. Then we'll see how brave you are. Joe's hand tightened on his pistol. Take your hands off her. Now. Stay out of this, rancher. This is between me and my wife. She's my wife. She's my property. The slap came before Clara knew she was going to do it. Her palm connected with Silas's cheek, hard enough to snap his head to the side. The sound echoed across the yard like a gunshot. Silas released her wrist. His eyes went wide with shock, and then darker with rage than Clara had ever seen them. You'll pay for that. Maybe, but it was worth it. Silas lunged. Clara stumbled backward, and then Joe was there, his fist connecting with Silas's jaw in a solid right cross that sent the man sprawling in the dirt. I warned you, Joe said, standing over him. Touch her again and I'll break every bone in your hand. Silas scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his split lip. His fine suit was ruined, covered in Montana dust. His careful composure had shattered completely, revealing the ugly truth beneath. You'll regret this, he spat. Both of you. I'll have lawyers. I'll have the territorial marshal. You'll leave. The voice was small but clear. Everyone turned. Rosie stood in the doorway. Her small hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Her dark eyes blazed with a fury too big for her 5-year-old frame. That's my mama, she said. And you're bad. Go away. Silas stared at the child like she was speaking a foreign language. What did you say? I said go away. Rosie's voice rose to a scream. "You're mean and ugly and I hate you. Leave my mama alone." Clara's heart cracked open. This child, this silent, wounded child who hadn't spoken for 8 months, was standing up to a monster on her behalf. "Rosie, sweetheart." "No!" Rosie ran across the porch, threw herself at Clara's legs, and glared at Silas with all the righteous fury a child could muster. "She's my mama. You can't have her." Something shifted in the air. The ranch hands had gathered near the bunkhouse watching. Old Pete stood with his rifle. Sarah Beth clutched her children close. Even the horses seemed to sense the importance of the moment. "You see what you've done?" Silas's voice shook with rage. "You've corrupted a child, filled her head with lies. When I get you back to Cincinnati, I'll make sure you're not taking her anywhere." Joe stepped forward, his stance wide, his hand back on his pistol. "Clara is my wife. This is her home. That's her daughter. And if you want any of them, you'll have to go through me, through every man on this ranch, and through the law itself. Because I promise you, Garrett, you won't win." Silas looked around at the faces watching him. The ranch hands, the women, the child still clinging to Clara's skirt. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and out of his element. "This isn't over," he said softly. "I have connections. I have money. I'll file charges against both of you. Bigamy, kidnapping, fraud. By the time I'm done, you'll lose everything, the ranch, the child, each other. Get off my land." Silas mounted his horse, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. At the edge of the yard, he paused and looked back at Clara. "I'll see you in court, darling. And when I do, you'll wish you'd never run." He rode away. Clara watched him go, her whole body shaking, Rosie still pressed against her legs. "Is he gone?" Rosie whispered. "He's gone, baby." "Will he come back?" Clara looked at Joe, at the ranch hands, at the family she'd built from nothing. "He might try," she said honestly, "but we won't let him hurt us, not ever again." Joe gathered them both into his arms, and Clara let herself collapse against his chest. The terror was still there, coiled in her gut like a living thing. But it was smaller now, weaker, because she wasn't facing it alone. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Joe rode to town and sent telegrams to lawyers in Helena. Clara gathered every piece of evidence she could find, the medical records from Ohio, letters from neighbors who'd witnessed Silas's cruelty, even the old scars that still marked her body. "It's not enough," she said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. "His word against mine. A rich man from the East against a woman no one's ever heard of." "It's more than nothing," Sarah Beth said. "And you've got witnesses here too. People who've seen what you've built, who you've become. That has to count for something." "Does it? Silas can afford the best lawyers in the territory? He can make people believe anything. Then we give them the truth." Joe came in from outside, his face grim. "I just got word from Doc Williams in town. He wants to talk to you. Says he's got information that might help." Clara went to town that afternoon. Doc Williams was a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands that still steadied after 40 years of surgery. "Sit down, Mrs. Callahan. I've got something to tell you, and it's not easy to hear." Clara sat, her hands twisted in her lap. "Your husband, your first husband, I mean, he's not from Cincinnati originally. Did you know that? No. He never talked about his past. That's because his past includes a dead wife." Doc Williams pushed a telegram across his desk. "I've got a colleague in St. Louis. Used to practice there before the war. He remembered a man named Silas Garrett from about 10 years back. Had a wife who died under suspicious circumstances. The coroner ruled it an accident, fell down the stairs, but there were bruises on her body that didn't match a fall. Bruises on her wrists, her throat." Clara's blood ran cold. "He killed her." Nothing was ever proven. Garrett had money connections. The investigation went nowhere. But my colleague never forgot. He's been waiting 30 years for someone to ask the right questions. And he'll testify, put this on record. He'll do more than that. He's got copies of the original coroner's report, the witness statements that were suppressed. Everything Garrett's money couldn't make disappear completely. Doc Williams leaned forward. "You're not the first woman this man has hurt, Mrs. Callahan. But you might be the last if we play this right." Clara carried the telegram home like a lit fuse. By the time she reached the ranch, her fear had transformed into something else entirely. Fury. He killed his first wife. She told Joe that night after Rosie was asleep. Beat her to death and made it look like an accident. And then he came looking for another victim. Found my uncle. Found me. We'll destroy him. No, we'll expose him. Show everyone exactly what kind of monster he is. Clara's hands shook, but her voice was steel. He wanted to take me back to Cincinnati and cure me of my delusions. But the only delusion was ever thinking he was human. The territorial hearing was set for 1 week later. Silas had filed charges of bigamy and fraud, claiming Clara was still legally his wife and her marriage to Joe was invalid. He'd hired the best lawyers money could buy. But Clara had something better. She had the truth. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch watching the stars when Rosie appeared beside her in her nightgown. "Can't sleep either," Clara asked. Rosie shook her head, climbed into Clara's lap and nestled against her chest. "Are you scared about tomorrow?" A nod. "Me too." Clara stroked the child's hair. "But you know what being scared doesn't mean we can't be brave. It just means being brave matters more." "Will the bad man go away forever?" "I hope so, baby. I really hope so." "I told him to go away." Rosie's voice was small but proud. "I yelled at him." "You did. You were so brave. The bravest girl in all of Montana." "I didn't want him to take you." Rosie's arms tightened around Clara's neck. "You're my mama. He can't have you." Clara's eyes burned. "He won't, sweetheart, I promise. No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here with you and Papa. Forever." "You promise?" "I promise." They stayed there until Rosie fell asleep in her arms. Then Joe appeared, lifted the child gently, and carried her inside. When he came back, he sat beside Clara and took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "we face it together." Together. Clara agreed. She didn't sleep that night. But for the first time in 8 months, the fear didn't keep her awake. Hope did. The Helena courthouse was packed. Word had spread about the trial, the Eastern businessman claiming his runaway wife, the Montana rancher who'd married her, the accusations flying in both directions. People came from miles around to watch. Clara walked into the courtroom with Joe on one side and old Pete on the other. She wore her best dress, the one Sarah Beth had altered to fit her changed body. Her hair was pinned up neat. Her head was held high. Silas sat at the plaintiff's table, immaculate in a new suit, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive coats. He smiled when he saw her, that same poisonous smile. But Clara didn't flinch. The judge was a woman. Clara hadn't expected that. She was iron-haired and sharp-eyed, introduced as Judge Margaret Stone, the first female judge in Montana Territory. "Let's keep this civil," Judge Stone said. "I've read the filings. Mr. Garrett claims his wife abandoned him while suffering from mental illness and entered into a fraudulent marriage. Mrs. Callahan claims the original marriage was abusive and she fled for her safety. We'll hear evidence from both sides." Silas's lawyers went first. They painted a picture of a devoted husband, a confused wife, a tragic situation that could be resolved simply by returning Clara to her rightful home. They produced marriage documents, financial records, testimony from Ohio neighbors about what a kind and generous man Silas Garrett was. Then it was Clara's turn. She told her story. All of it. The broken ribs. The locked doors. The words that had made her believe she deserved every blow. Her voice shook sometimes, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. 8 months of silence had built up inside her, and now it poured out like a flood. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Then Doc Williams took the stand. He presented the telegram from St. Louis. The coroner's report. The witness statements. A decade-old murder that had never been solved because the murderer had money and power, and no one willing to stand against him. Silas's face went white. His lawyers scrambled for objections, but Judge Stone overruled them all. This evidence suggests a pattern of behavior, she said. A history of violence that was never properly investigated. Mr. Garrett, do you have anything to say in your defense? Silas stood. For a moment, Clara saw the mask slip completely. The cold fury, the calculating rage, the monster she'd lived with for 3 years. This is a conspiracy, he said. These people are lying. My wife is mentally ill, and they've exploited her condition to steal her from me. I demand. You don't get to demand anything in my courtroom. Judge Stone's voice cut like a whip. What you get is the opportunity to explain why 2 separate women connected to you have ended up dead or claiming abuse. What you get is the chance to prove you're not the monster this evidence suggests you are. Silas's mouth opened, closed. His lawyers whispered urgently, but he waved them away. I want what's mine, he said finally. That woman is my wife. I paid for her. I own her. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Judge Stone leaned forward. You paid for her? Her uncle owed me money. The marriage was arranged to settle the debt. She was part of the transaction. She belongs to me. Clara's heart pounded. Silas had just admitted in open court that their marriage had been a financial transaction, not a legal union between consenting adults. Judge Stone's expression hardened. Mr. Garrett, I don't know how things work in Ohio, but in Montana territory, we don't buy and sell women. The marriage you've described isn't valid, it's indentured servitude, and that's illegal under federal law. That's not, I didn't mean, I've heard enough. Judge Stone picked up her gavel. The charges of bigamy and fraud against Clara Sullivan Callahan are dismissed. The marriage between Silas Garrett and Lena Whitmore, having been entered into under coercion and without proper consent, is hereby annulled. The gavel fell. Clara's knees gave out. Joe caught her before she hit the floor, held her up while the courtroom erupted in chaos around them. It's over, he said in her ear. Clara, it's over. You're free. But Judge Stone wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her voice cutting through the noise, I'm referring the evidence regarding Mr. Garrett's first wife to the Federal Marshal's Office for investigation. Mr. Garrett, I suggest you remain in the territory until that investigation is complete. Silas's face contorted with rage. He lunged toward the judge's bench, but the court bailiffs were faster. They grabbed him, wrestled him back, held him while he screamed obscenities that made the women in the gallery cover their children's ears. Get him out of my courtroom, Judge Stone ordered. And someone send word to the federal marshal. We've got a lot more to discuss about Mr. Garrett's past. They dragged Silas away. His screams echoed down the hallway, growing fainter, until finally there was silence. Clara stood in the middle of the courtroom, Joe's arms around her, and tried to remember how to breathe. I'm free, she whispered. You're free, Joe confirmed. Legally, permanently, completely free. He can't touch me. Not ever again. Clara started to laugh, then to cry. Then both at once, her body shaking with the release of 8 months of fear and 3 years of captivity and a lifetime of believing she wasn't worth saving. Joe held her through all of it. When they walked out of the courthouse, the sun was setting over Helena. The sky blazed orange and gold and pink colors too beautiful for the darkness that had preceded them. Old Pete was waiting with the wagon. Well, he asked. Case dismissed, Joe said. Marriage annulled. And Silas Garrett is about to have a very long conversation with the federal marshals about a dead wife in St. Louis. Pete's weathered face broke into a grin. Hot damn! That's the best news I've heard in 20 years. Clara climbed into the wagon, exhausted to her bones but lighter than she'd felt since before she could remember. The road home stretched out before them, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what waited at the end. "Let's go," she said. "Rosie's waiting, and I've got biscuits to make." Joe laughed, climbed up beside her, and took the reins. "Yes, ma'am. Whatever you say, ma'am." They rode toward home as the stars came out one by one, and Clara Callahan finally, truly, completely. Clara Callahan watched them appear and thought they looked like promises. Promises she was finally free to keep. The news of Silas Garrett's downfall spread through Silver Creek faster than summer wildfire. By the time Clara and Joe returned to the ranch, half the territory knew the story the Eastern businessman exposed as a murderer, the cook who'd escaped his clutches, the rancher who'd stood by her side. But Clara barely had time to breathe before the next crisis demanded her attention. "Mercer's deadline," Joe said the morning after the trial. 3 days left, and we're still $2,000 short. Clara sat at the kitchen table surrounded by ledgers and receipts. The bakery had grown beyond anything she'd imagined, but growth took time they didn't have. "We could sell some cattle," she said. "At current prices, we'd lose more than we'd gain, and we'd cripple the breeding program Pete's been building for years. The equipment, the wagon, wouldn't cover half of it." Rosie wandered in, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She climbed into Clara's lap and settled there like she belonged, which she did. "What's wrong, Mama?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Grown-up problems." "Can I help?" Clara kissed the top of her head. "You already do, just by being here." Old Pete appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Rider coming. Looks like Mercer." Joe's hand went to his pistol. "Stay inside. Both of you." "Joe." "I mean it, Clara. Let me handle this." He was out the door before she could argue. Clara held Rosie close and listened through the open window. "Callahan." Mercer's voice dripped with satisfaction. "I'm here to discuss our arrangement. 3 days left, and I'm guessing you still can't pay." "We're working on it." "Working on it won't cut water to your cattle or foreclose on your land. Cash will. You have it or you don't. And if I need more time?" "Time's expensive, friend. Another week would cost you, let's say, 500 extra. Call it interest." "That's robbery. That's business. Take it or leave it." Clara's blood boiled. She set Rosie down gently. "Stay here, baby. Don't move." "But Mama." "Stay." She walked out onto the porch. Mercer's eyes swept over her with that familiar contempt, the look men gave women they considered beneath notice. "Ah, the baker. Or should I say the bigamist I heard about your trial. Quite the scandal." "The only scandal was a man who thought he could own another human being. Seems to be a common affliction around here." Mercer's smile turned cold. "Careful, Mrs. Callahan. Your husband's already in debt to me. Don't add to his troubles." "His troubles are my troubles, and I'm not afraid of you." "You should be. I've faced worse than a greedy man with delusions of power. I stood in a courtroom yesterday and watched a monster get dragged away in chains. You think I'm scared of paperwork and threats?" Clara stepped closer. "Let me tell you something about myself, Judge Mercer. 6 months ago, I was running for my life. I had nothing but a carpet bag and bruises I couldn't hide. I came to this ranch expecting to disappear to survive, to wait until I could run again." She gestured at the land around them. "Instead, I built a business. I became a mother. I married a man who treats me like an equal. I turned flour and water into something that feeds half the mining camps in the territory. And I did it all while terrified that my past would catch up with me." Touching story. Doesn't change what you owe. "No, but it changes what I'm willing to fight for." Clara's eyes locked with his. "This ranch is my home. These people are my family. And I will burn everything I've built to the ground before I let you take it from us." Mercer studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect exactly, but a recognition that he was dealing with someone who wouldn't fold easily. "You've got spirit," he said finally. "I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't pay debts. 3 days, Mrs. Callahan. Then I take what's mine." He rode away without looking back. Joe came to stand beside her. That was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. Clara leaned against him, suddenly exhausted. "We need more time. We need a miracle. Fresh out of miracles around here. Then we make our own." The idea came to her that night while she lay awake listening to Joe breathe beside her. The bakery was profitable, but it couldn't generate $2,000 in 3 days. No legitimate business could. But maybe she didn't need to generate it. Maybe she needed to find it. She slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen. Pulled out every piece of paper related to her past, the documents from the trial, the letters from Doc Williams, the telegram about Silas's first wife. And there, buried in the stack, she found something she'd forgotten. Her mother's will. Clara's hands shook as she read it. Her parents had left her an inheritance, a substantial one held in trust until she turned 25. But her uncle had been the trustee. He'd controlled the money, doled it out in pittances, while claiming the rest was tied up in investments. Investments that had never existed. Her uncle had stolen her inheritance, used it to pay his gambling debts. And when the money ran out, he'd sold her to Silas to cover the rest. But if the original trust still existed, if some portion of her parents' estate had survived her uncle's embezzlement. Clara grabbed a lantern and went to find the strongbox where she kept her most important documents. There at the bottom was a letter she'd never opened. It had arrived at her uncle's house shortly before her wedding to Silas, and she'd tucked it away without reading it, too overwhelmed by everything happening to deal with one more piece of mail. The return address was a law firm in Kentucky, her parents' home state. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. "Dear Miss Sullivan," the letter began, "we are writing to inform you that the trust established by your parents Marcus and Ellen Sullivan will mature on your 25th birthday. As the sole beneficiary, you are entitled to the full remaining balance of the trust minus administrative fees. Please contact our offices at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of funds." The amount listed made Clara's knees buckle. $18,000. She read it again, and again. The numbers didn't change. Her parents had left her $18,000. Her uncle had stolen most of it, but the law firm had protected the principal, had been holding it for her, waiting for her to claim it, while she'd spent 3 years as Silas's prisoner and 8 months running for her life. "Clara," Joe's voice came from the doorway. "What are you doing up?" She turned to face him, the letter clutched in her hand. "I found it." "Found what?" "Our miracle." She explained everything, the trust, the inheritance, her uncle's theft, the law firm in Kentucky that had been trying to reach her for years. Joe listened in stunned silence. When she finished, he sat down heavily at the kitchen table. $18,000. Enough to pay Mercer 6 times over. Enough to expand the bakery, buy more land, secure Rosie's future. Clara's voice cracked. "My parents left it for me. They wanted me to be safe, to be free, and I almost never knew. But you know now." Joe pulled her into his lap, held her close. "You found it when you needed it most. That's not coincidence, Clara. That's providence. Or stubbornness. Same thing around here." They sent a telegram to the Kentucky law firm that morning. The response came back within hours. The funds would be transferred to the bank in Helena within the week. Sooner if Clara could provide proper identification and documentation. Judge Stone, it turned out, was happy to provide both. She signed an affidavit confirming Clara's identity and legal status, adding a personal note that she hoped the money would be used to build something lasting. Clara rode to Helena herself to complete the transfer. The banker was a thin man with spectacles and a suspicious nature, but he couldn't argue with Judge Stone's signature or the Kentucky firm's verification. "It's all here," he said, sliding a bank draft across the desk. $18,427, minus the wire fee. Clara stared at the number. More money than she'd ever seen. More than she'd ever imagined having. "I'd like to withdraw $3,000 in cash," she said, "and set up an account for the rest." Of course, Mrs. Callahan, right away. She rode back to the ranch with the money in a locked box flanked by Old Pete and two of the ranch hands. Nobody was taking this from her. Not now. Not ever. Judge Mercer arrived on the morning of the deadline, clearly expecting to find a broken family ready to surrender. Instead, he found Clara waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee in one hand and a bank envelope in the other. "Good morning, Judge," she said pleasantly. "I believe we have business to conclude." Mercer dismounted, his eyes narrowing. "You have the money. Every penny, plus the interest you demanded. Would you like to count it?" She held out the envelope. Mercer snatched it, tore it open, and rifled through the bills with increasing disbelief. "This is how did you? That's my business, not yours. Now I believe you brought documents, a signed release stating that all debts are paid and you have no further claim on this property. I didn't think clearly." Clara's smile didn't waver. "The documents, Judge. Unless you'd prefer I involve the territorial marshal in our transaction, I hear they're already interested in some of your other dealings. Something about water rights and fraudulent contracts." Mercer's face went pale. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, signed it with shaking hands, and thrust it at Clara. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Clara tucked the release into her apron pocket. "Now get off my land, and don't come back." Mercer left. Clara watched him go, waited until he was out of sight, and then let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months. "You did it." Joe came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You actually did it." "We did it. All of us." "No." He turned her to face him. "You did it. You found the money. You stood up to Mercer. You've been fighting this whole time and you won." Clara looked at him, this man who'd given her a home when she had nothing, who'd defended her against her demons, who'd loved her when she didn't know how to love herself. "I didn't win," she said softly. "I just stopped losing." The summer turned to autumn, and the Callahan Ranch transformed along with it. Clara's bakery expanded into a proper operation with a second oven and 3 women employed full-time. The mining camps had become regular customers, and the Fort contract brought in enough steady income to make the ranch truly profitable for the first time in years. Rosie started school in Silver Creek. She was still quieter than most children, still prone to silence when strangers got too close. But she spoke now, chattering to Clara about her lessons, arguing with her father about bedtime singing hymns, in a voice that grew stronger every Sunday at Reverend Thomas's church. On the first anniversary of Clara's arrival at the ranch, the household gathered for a celebration that felt more like a homecoming. "Speech!" Old Pete hollered, banging his cup on the table. "The missus needs to give a speech." "I'm not giving a speech." "You built a business from nothing. You saved this ranch. You made that little girl talk again. If that don't deserve a speech, I don't know what does." Clara looked around the table at the faces watching her. Joe, his eyes warm with love. Rosie bouncing with excitement. Sarah Beth and her children. The ranch hands who'd become family. Old Pete grinning through tobacco-stained teeth. "Fine," she said. "One speech. But you're not allowed to make fun of me when I cry." "No promises." Clara stood her hand, finding Joe's shoulder for support. "A year ago," she began. "I stepped off a stagecoach in Silver Creek with nothing but a carpet bag and a new name. I was running from a man who'd convinced me I was worthless. I was looking for a place to disappear until I could run again." Her voice steadied. "Instead, I found this ranch. I found a widower who needed a cook and a daughter who needed a mother. I found work that mattered, and people who saw me as more than my past." She looked at Rosie. "I found a little girl who taught me that love doesn't require words, it just requires showing up." She looked at Joe. "I found a man who showed me what real partnership looks like, who fought for me when I didn't know how to fight for myself, who loved me before I remembered how to love myself." Her eyes moved around the table. "I found a family. Not the one I was born into. Better. One I chose, and one that chose me back." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. A year ago, I was a woman with no name, no home, and no hope. Today, I'm Clara Sullivan Callahan. I'm a wife, a mother, a business owner. I have a home that no one can take from me, and a family that will never let me face anything alone. She raised her cup. To second chances, to found families, to the stubborn conviction that we deserve better than what we've been given. To Clara, the table roared back. Later, after the celebration had wound down and Rosie was asleep, Clara stood on the porch with Joe. The Montana sky stretched overhead, vast and dark, and filled with stars. "You're thinking about something," Joe said. "I'm thinking about the woman who arrived here a year ago. How scared she was. How broken. And now," Clara turned to face him, "now I'm thinking about the future, about what we're building, about whether I'm ready for it." "Ready for what?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. Joe went still. His eyes searched her face, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Clara, are you?" "Doc Williams confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to wait until today to tell you. Seemed fitting." Joe's response was to sweep her into his arms, spinning her around with a whoop of joy that probably woke half the ranch hands. "A baby," he said, setting her down, but not letting go. "We're having a baby. We're having a baby. Does Rosie know?" "Not yet. I wanted you to know first." "She's going to be impossible. She's been asking for a sibling since—" Joe stopped, his voice cracking. "Since before Eliza died. She wanted a brother or sister so badly and we couldn't, and then Eliza was gone, and I never thought—" Clara cupped his face in her hands. "You never thought you'd have this again." "I didn't deserve to have it again. After everything I got wrong. After failing Eliza, failing Rosie. You didn't fail anyone. You survived. You kept going. You kept that little girl alive and loved even when you were drowning in grief." Clara kissed him gently. "And when I showed up at your door scared and broken and ready to run, you gave me a chance. You let me stay. You let me become part of this family. You became the heart of this family. Then let me tell you something." Clara took a deep breath. "I spent 3 years being told I was worthless. 8 months believing I didn't deserve to be happy. And even after everything we've been through, there's still a voice in my head that says, this can't last, that something will go wrong, that I'll wake up and find out it was all a dream. Clara. But I'm not listening to that voice anymore. I'm choosing to believe in this, in us, in the family we're building and the life we're creating." She pressed his hand harder against her stomach. "I'm choosing to believe that this child will grow up safe and loved and knowing they're wanted. That Rosie will never feel alone again. That you and I will grow old together, arguing about cattle prices and biscuit recipes and whose turn it is to check on the baby at midnight." Joe laughed, tears streaming down his face. "I love you." "I know. I love you too." Clara smiled through her own tears. "Now take me to bed. We've got a lot of future to plan for, and I'm exhausted." The next morning, Clara woke to Rosie bouncing on the bed and Joe bringing her breakfast on a tray. "Mama, Mama, Papa says there's a surprise." "What's the surprise?" Clara sat up, exchanging a look with Joe over their daughter's head. "Well," she said slowly, "how would you feel about being a big sister?" Rosie's eyes went wide. "A baby. We're getting a baby. We're getting a baby." The shriek that followed could probably be heard in Helena. Rosie threw herself at Clara, then at Joe, then back at Clara, talking so fast her words tumbled over each other. "I'm gonna teach it everything. I'm gonna show it how to make biscuits, and find the best rocks and ride horses, and Mama, what if it's a boy? Boys are gross. Tommy Henderson picks his nose and—" "Even if it's a boy," Clara said laughing, "I'm sure it won't pick its nose. Much. Can I name it? Can I help? Can I tell everyone?" "Yes, yes, and yes. But breakfast first." They ate together, the three of them, in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home. Outside, the ranch hands were already at work. Sarah Beth's children were chasing chickens in the yard. Old Pete was probably complaining about his joints somewhere. And Clara Sullivan Callahan sat in the middle of it all, finally understanding what it meant to belong. 6 months later, on a cold spring morning, she gave birth to a son. They named him Marcus after her father, the man who'd loved her enough to leave her an inheritance that had saved everything. Rosie held her brother for the first time with the careful seriousness of someone given a sacred responsibility. "I'm going to protect you forever," she whispered. "Nobody will ever hurt you. Not ever." Clara watched her children together, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Joe came to sit beside her, taking her hand. "You did it," he said softly. "Did what?" "Everything. Built a business, saved a ranch, healed a little girl, made a family." He kissed her forehead. "Proved to everyone, including yourself, that you were worth fighting for all along." Clara leaned into him, exhausted and happy, and more at peace than she'd ever been. "I didn't do it alone." "No, but you started it. You showed up when everyone expected you to run. You stayed when everything told you to leave. You chose this life, Clara, and that choice made everything else possible." She looked around the room, at her son in her daughter's arms, at her husband beside her, at the home she'd built from nothing but flour and determination, and the stubborn refusal to believe she didn't deserve to be happy. A year and a half ago, she'd been a woman without a name running from a monster, convinced she'd never be more than someone else's property. Now she was Clara Sullivan Callahan. Wife, mother, business owner, survivor. She'd arrived at this ranch looking for a place to hide. Instead, she'd found a place to stand. And she was never running again.